NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was in Washington, D.C. this week, meeting with Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. This is just a couple weeks ahead of the 2-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And joining me to talk a little bit more about the anniversary, as it's right around the corner here, Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2008 to 2009. He served as U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations from 2017 to 2019, and he's now a distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Ambassador Volker, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
So with the NATO Secretary General coming into Washington, D.C. this week to meet with Mr. Blinken and Mr. Austin, was the reason for his visit the most obvious reason to simply encourage the U.S. to continue funding Ukraine's war effort?
I think that's part of it. Certainly, there is a need for more military support to Ukraine because Russia keeps attacking them and they keep killing civilians and they keep bombing cities. And so Ukraine needs help to defend itself. But in addition to that, there's going to be NATO's 75th anniversary summit taking place in Washington, D.C. this July. And so there's some planning going on for that as well. What does NATO say about Ukraine? How far can we go in helping them? Will there be any direct NATO role in assisting Ukraine? Those are things that I think are on the agenda there as well. So I think there's just a good opportunity to coordinate about where things are headed. Finally, this is Secretary General Stoltenberg's last year. The assumption is that they will finally select a new Secretary General. And there's probably some coordination going on behind the scenes about that, too.
So as we approach this 2-year anniversary of the Ukraine war, how are things going? I mean, it's really fallen off the news. I mean, the conversation about funding Ukraine is certainly front and center, but we're not hearing a whole lot about where things stand on the battlefield right now.
Yeah. And this is very important for people to hear. So thank you for putting that question out there. 2 years ago, Russia launched this massive invasion of Ukraine, moving into the country with tanks and armor, from about 5 or 6 different directions. And they took over huge pieces of territory, including just to the north of Kyiv, the capital city. Over the course of the next year, the Ukrainians pushed that back, and they've taken back about half of everything that Russia took in those first months of the invasion. But since then, the war has now settled along a front line where the Ukrainians have been able to take back small amounts of territory, but nothing decisive. Russia has taken some additional territory, but nothing decisive. It is a bloody artillery battle right on the front lines there. And the war has shifted in a way because what Russia has resorted to now is just attacking civilian targets, just attacking cities, just attacking power supplies, energy distribution networks. They're using missiles, bombs, drones, just to go after Ukrainian cities because they can't do much else. Ukraine has tried to use precision-guided long-range munitions to knock out Russia's logistical supply lines, and also to take out pieces of Russia's Black Sea fleet and push them away from the western part of the Black Sea where the port of Odessa is, so that Ukraine can have access to global markets again through shipping. So Ukraine has pushed back, continued to do so. They've sunk about 20% of the Black Sea fleet. They've knocked out Sebastopol as a viable harbor for Russian ships. So Russia has had to pull back to the Russian coastline. This has enabled Ukraine to restart shipments out of ports. And with the longer range munitions and drones that they have, they're now blowing up fuel depots and ammunition depots and defense industry, even inside Russia, with their own homegrown equipment. So that's been the change in the nature of the war. Now, the U.S. assistance is important because we're going to be resupplying ammunition and equipment for Ukraine so they can continue to defend themselves because Russia keeps attacking. But it is not likely to produce a major change in the trajectory of the war unless we actually ramp up with some of the equipment that we have held back on so far. Doesn't seem like the Biden administration is ready to do that. They are holding back on the longest range artillery. They're holding back on airframes. So we're not giving Ukraine the air superiority they would need to actually advance on the ground. But we will make sure that Ukraine continues to survive as a sovereign, independent European democracy, which is all they need and all they want. I should take that back. It's not all they need and all they want. They want to take all of their territory back and free all of their people who are living under Russian occupation right now. But we're not giving them the means to do that. But at least Ukraine, as a national identity and as a country, will survive.
And I think a lot of the arguments that folks have had against arming Ukraine or continuing to put money into Ukraine is that the goal for Ukraine is, as you mentioned, to eject Russia from their country so they can have their country back. But if it doesn't seem as though the Biden administration is willing to go all the way in order to help Ukraine fully do that, the argument against funding Ukraine is then, well, why send anything, why do anything at this point unless you're going to go full force and allow Ukraine to actually fulfill its mission? Does that hold any water?
Well, it's a great question. It's a great question because we should be giving the Ukrainians what they need, and we're not. And so the question, as you asked, is, well, then why keep giving them stuff if we're not serious? And the answer to that, however, is because Russia keeps killing them. We can't just sit by and watch as Russia, lobs bomb after bomb, missile after missile, drone after drone at Ukrainian cities all over Ukraine. This is just unconscionable. So they need the help to defend themselves. But you're right, we should also be doing more to actually help them win.
Is Ukraine's goal realistic? Can they achieve that goal? Or at some point, are they going to need to reassess what's possible?
Well, when you look at will, and so much of warfare is about a challenge of will, Ukrainians have far more will to defend their families and their homeland than the Russians have to attack it.
Hmm.
So, in that sense, in a test of wills, Ukraine measures up. What they don't have today is all of the equipment, all of the ammunition that they would need to accomplish that goal. They are holding the line and they are investing massively in their own defenses. We talk at NATO about spending 2% of GDP on defense. Ukraine is spending something like 40% of GDP on defense. So
Yeah.
they are massively investing, and they have the know-how, they have the educated workforce. They will build a defense industry that will give them more capability in the future, but that's going to take time.
At this point, what is Russia's winning scenario? I mean, what can they reasonably hope to accomplish? And is that something the US is willing to live with?
Well, what Russia wants, or what Putin wants, is very clear. He wants to eliminate Ukraine as a sovereign state, take it all over, make it part of the Russian Empire, have a local government in Ukraine that is responsive to him. That's never going to happen, but that's what he wants. And what he's hoping for is that he can outlast the West. He's willing to take the casualties. He's willing to spend the money and use the military equipment they've got and hope that he can outlast the Western will to actually support Ukraine. And he's hoping maybe for, elections in the US or elections in Europe, some roll of the dice that he's going to get lucky and the West will stop supporting Ukraine. And just outlast us. I don't think that will happen either, but that is clearly what he's betting on.
So, in terms of the United States' role here, and in terms of their role with NATO as a whole, there are some who would love to see the United States withdraw from NATO, or at least have less of an involvement with NATO. Wanting to look more inward rather than helping countries, traditional allies, outward. Is there a concern for you in the direction of the country that we're heading that direction? Or do you feel like that there's still enough of a connection to NATO and that European interests still remain American interests?
Well, two things. First, you do hear voices like that, but they are the exception. The vast majority of people and the vast majority of politicians in both political parties strongly support NATO and understand the value that provides to the United States. That by banding together and treating an attack on one as an attack on all, it prevents war. It means that no one will attack NATO countries. And
Right.
so it is a bargain for the U.S. that, we were dragged into World War I, we were dragged into World War II, we had tremendous casualties, and our leaders after World War II had the courage and the foresight to recognize that Stalin was a threat, and that if we didn't actually get Europe banded together to defend ourselves collectively with the United States and Europe, that Stalin would take over Europe, or he would try, and there would be more war. And instead, by founding NATO the way we did in 1949, we have not had a major war in Europe that has dragged the U.S. into it. We've had crises in Bosnia and Kosovo where we chose to get involved, but we were not dragged into fighting a war because NATO was there. Now we have a situation where, because Ukraine's not in NATO, Putin felt like it was fair game to attack. Now we've got to actually end that war and then put the lid back on.
Well, certainly a very volatile situation. It remains a volatile situation 2 years after it started, and no shortage of opinion on it here in the United States in terms of how involved the United States should get on it. But Ambassador Volker, I really appreciate your time, and everyone, please make sure that you're following what Ambassador Volker is doing over at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Ambassador, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.